I have the great pleasure to guide you through this exciting get-together of leading personalities in the healthcare industry and the political landscape today. Our topic, as you know, pandemic management and preparedness in the US and Germany, looking forward. So we'd love to discuss with our distinguished panelists some ideas and possibly strategies for a better future and a possible way out of the pandemic we have been living with for more than a year now. This event is part of a series organized by the German consulates in Boston and San Francisco, together with the American-German Business Council in Boston and the German-American Business Association in Northern California, and presented today under the auspices of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. And with that, I am delighted to introduce the German ambassador to the United States of America, Dr. Emily Haber. Emily, please.
Thank you for the introduction. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's event on pandemic management and preparedness in Germany and the US. We're still struggling to overcome the current crisis, and people are becoming more and more anxious for a return to normal. Over the course of the last year, we've seen similarities in our approaches and in the impact of the crisis, but also stark contrast at times. Today, we want to take a look forward. What will a new normal for Germany and the US look like? What does future pandemic preparedness need to look like in order to enable us to better deal with similar challenges? Today's event is evidence of great cooperation, not only across the Atlantic, but also across the US, literally from coast to coast, and among different sectors. Cooperation between different actors is also a main topic of our discussion today. With our panel, we are bringing together leaders from both the public and the private sectors from the US and Germany. Together, our experts will look at the lessons learned from the current pandemic, and they will discuss what lies ahead and what we need to do to be better prepared for future challenges to global health. Only a few decades ago, some experts were convinced that infectious diseases and pandemics were a thing of the past. However, recent years have shown that we were often only lucky to have escaped pandemics on a global scale when viruses like SARS or MERS had emerged and had wreaked havoc in parts of the world. There's no doubt that today's interconnectedness is a major factor in the global spread of infectious diseases. Does this mean that we rescind interconnectedness? By all means, no. On the contrary, we need to identify and strengthen ways how to put it to our advantage in fighting pandemics. Modern technology and mobility make it far easier to share resources and expertise. The pandemic has shown new ways of cooperation between states, governments, scientific research institutions, private sector, and different companies. The ACT Accelerator and the COVAX facility are a testimony to this actor from different sectors getting together to coordinate the global vaccination effort. The pandemic has also served as a powerful reminder of the crucial role of the WHO. Hopefully, the current sense of urgency will provide the necessary impetus to its reform process. I would like to thank everybody who contributed to today's event. I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion, and back to you, Professor Janus.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Let's now get together with our distinguished panelists. As you know, it has been a year since the initial lockdowns around the world, including in Germany and in the US. And pandemic management and public health responses have differed greatly from country to country. Great examples are changing, it seems like, more frequently than the seasons. And the most important tool to put strategies into action, the trust of people, has been harmed considerably. Disappointment and a desperate desire for getting back to the world as it was before are the benchmark nowadays, against which all actions are being measured. Although vaccines have been developed and manufactured in record time, neither Germany nor the US seem to have found the holy grail of pandemic management. But as history tells us, there is usually not one perfect way of doing things. Nevertheless, we can exchange ideas for approaches and hopefully learn from each other. In an increasingly nationalistic and fragmented world, I believe that people talking to people is still the only way to tackle the most pressing issues. And therefore, we have this distinguished panel with us today, featuring leading experts of public health, agencies, and pharmaceutical companies on both sides of the Atlantic. I'd love to introduce briefly our panelists. You have more information on their bios in the link provided in the invitation. So very briefly, I'd like to start with Professor Dr. Wieler, who is the president of the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. That's the leading research institution in the field of disease control and prevention. The institute is central in carrying out research, informing the public, and advising the government on the COVID-19 outbreak and response. Welcome, Professor Wieler. Then we have Lois Pace. She has just been appointed to the US Department of Health and Human Services as its director of the Office of Global Affairs. She most recently served as president and executive director of the Global Health Council and was a member of the Biden-Harris Transition COVID-19 Advisory Board. Welcome, Lois. Pleasure to have you join us. And then we have Dr. Stefan Osman. He is the chairman of the executive board and CEO of Merck KGaA, Darmstadt, Germany, a leading science and technology company operating across healthcare, life sciences, and electronics with around 58,000 employees worldwide. As you know, the company has been instrumental in providing products and services to fight COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Osman. It's nice to have you with us as well. And then we have Dr. Richard Muschitsky, who is the Executive Vice President for Science and Regulatory Advocacy and the Chief Medical Officer at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, also known as PhRMA, which represents the country's leading innovative biopharmaceutical research companies. Welcome, Richard. Pleasure to have you. So let's get started. And I'd love to hear from everybody very briefly your perspective. Looking forward, that's our topic today. So we know where we stand, and we don't have the Holy Grail yet, but maybe we could talk a little bit about how we can move from a preparedness discussion to proactive pragmatism and roll up our sleeves and get going. Professor Wieler, would you like to get started, please?
Thanks indeed. It's a pleasure and it's an honor for me to be part of this panel. And so let's share my thoughts that are basically the same thoughts that I have since more than a year, because I'm deeply convinced that this is a typical public health perspective that we are addressing here. And I've said in one of my first announcements, in one of my press briefings, this is the time of public health, and this is the time where public health professionals need to do their work and their job. And obviously, they can only do this if a whole society accepts this approach, and if you both have a reliable governance in your particular country, if you have a certain education level in your particular country, if you have trust in official institutions, and of course, if you have the resources to be able to protect yourself against infections. And apart from one huge game changer, which obviously are vaccines. And I'd like to point this out here. It is extraordinarily successful that we have a vaccine that has already been launched in last year, already in December last year, some countries were able to start vaccination. This is an extraordinary scientific success, which, from my understanding, is not appreciated enough during these days, as many countries, in particular many societal groups, are very much discussing and criticizing the way that vaccines are rolled out. And some of the criticism is correct indeed. However, we should really be more than happy that these vaccines are already available in such huge amounts. So basically, from my understanding, the communication issue, apart from the preparedness, which clearly most of the countries were not prepared in a way they could have been prepared, with the exception of some countries in Asia that were very, very well prepared. And I'd like to mention here Vietnam. And I'd like to mention Vietnam because obviously Vietnam is not a country where we would see a high industrialized population, a high industrialized and scientific area. But this is why I'm particularly pointing at public health issues here, but a country whereby local health workers, people were appropriately educated basically how they could prevent infection in their homes, in their daily lives. And so this is basically my perspective, apart from all the technical tools that we have developed. And we are rich, at least in these two countries that we are here facing each other. We are rich in technology, we are rich in education, we are rich in science, and we are rich in terms of financial abilities, but perhaps we are poor when it comes to the local business, to the local understanding of a pandemic with this magnitude. And obviously, we have to work on understanding on a local level. And whatever kind of country we are, and whatever kind of political leadership we have, we can only contain a pandemic if each and everybody in this particular country understands what he or she has to do and can protect herself and himself from this pandemic. So that is the basics of my understanding. And then, of course, in addition, we need masks, we need vaccines, we need therapeutics, we need hospitals, we need medical doctors, but it's much more than this. And let me end with saying there was one of the questions, where are we standing now? Can we stop the research of a third wave, particularly in Germany? No, we can't stop this search apart from locking down our country again. Otherwise, we don't have any tools currently to lock down this, as long as we don't have enough immunized people in our country. We need, to our calculation, roughly 80% of the population being immune against this virus, as due to the existence of new virus variants. Obviously, both transmission as well as also the burden of disease has increased. And obviously, without an immunity in our population, we won't be safe until this has been reached. So yes, we have vaccines, but all the other tools we need to be in place, and we need the people to understand what they have to do to protect themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Wieler. I think you're raising a very important issue. It's also about educating and managing expectations. And I think that's a big part also of the misunderstanding on the side of the population. Thank you so much for your perspective. Lois, I'd love to hear from you. How do you think we can move towards a more pragmatic approach to managing the pandemic?
Well, thanks very much for the invitation to be here with you all today. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So I'll try and keep my remarks brief, but this question of how we prepare for the unexpected is interesting to me because I'm actually more focused on the unexpected aspect of that. I think for a lot of us in public health, this actually wasn't unexpected, sadly. And it might have been our worst nightmare that we never wanted to see come to fruition, or that we never fully imagined. And yet we know from many accounts pre-COVID that people did see this coming, sadly. And we in the US, for example, are reestablishing or have reestablished the very directorate that was active during the Ebola response, and which outlined ways that the world should respond should we have a situation such as the one we're in now. And so I think that's a core lesson learned for me, is acknowledging that that we did have some tools that we might not have necessarily utilized in the way, or fully utilized in the way that we could have. And so what will we do now with that information? What will we do now with that power of knowledge? And like Professor Wheeler said, it's critically important that obviously we focus on the response. We continue to acknowledge that we're very much in the midst of an emergency, particularly in the US, but around the world. Arguably, we in the States, I think people are aware of the number of cases that we have here and the degree to which that makes up for the world's cases and loss of life due to COVID-19. And so we and others beyond me, of course, I want to applaud the many others who are on the front lines fighting COVID-19 and continuing to acknowledge what's needed day to day. And yet I'm also mindful of what comes next, right? Beyond the response, what about the recovery? What about the rebuilding? What happens to our healthcare institutions now? And what could we put in place so that there's a readiness and a resilience that we truly realize in the wake of COVID-19? What about economic protections for individuals and families, or social services for particularly vulnerable or marginalized populations? These are all questions that we've had even before COVID-19, I might say, right? And we knew that there was a risk of these considerations really coming to the light, and now we are faced with them head on. And so I'm particularly keen to ensure that we are sort of both managing what's in front of us and also looking at the horizon to see how we can learn and adapt real time. And so I will begin my introductory comments by echoing some of what has been shared already, this idea of how we can focus on basic truths and needs now. And for me, those are plentiful, but I'm landing now on a few core truths. One is the credibility of experts, because I think the lesson that I learned in the past year is the importance of lifting up that expert credibility. Two is the power of innovation and acknowledging what happens when we truly come together towards a greater good. And three, the resilience of our citizens, of our communities, and of the people around us. So with that, I thank you again for having me, and look forward to what more others have to share.
Thank you so much, Lois. That's fantastic and very comprehensive. And I think, well, I'd love to follow up with you on, how we can put the tools into action. I think that's the most important right now to move forward. Dr. Osman, what's your perspective on this topic?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Janus. And, when we were talking about the unexpected, in 2016, Bill Gates published an article in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was at the height of the Ebola crisis. At that time, I was the chairman of the World Pharma Association. And Bill Gates then was predicting that a pandemic would hit us eventually. And he was calling for the world community to spend about $3.5 billion per year to be better prepared. And there were so many experts who had very similar approaches, and we had so many panels. We had them at the World Economic Forum, we had them at the Munich Security Conference, etc. Some things have happened in the meantime. For instance, the formation of CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. That's a prime example, which has paved the way for progress, especially for vaccine development for low and middle income countries. But finger pointing doesn't help. Nobody, apart from, as Professor Wheeler pointed out, apart from a few Asian countries, have really been well prepared. But where do we stand now? I think it's a small miracle that we have several vaccines ready today. This has only been possible through the incredibly hard work and outstanding collaboration of many scientists and companies and institutions around the world. And what I want to highlight is that, and it's shown by the development of vaccines, what we urgently need is even more collaboration across all sectors between politics, academia, industry, and other areas such as NGOs, foundations, etc. From a European perspective, I have to say that I'm extremely impressed by the work of BARDA that has been essential in vaccine development. We've been arguing for something like this in the European Union, and I hope that HERA, as the EU equivalent will be called, will be an equal success. I think the truth is that governments, international organizations, businesses, and NGOs all bring very different know-how to the table when approaching challenges like vaccine development and allocation, and we will be well advised to bundle these strengths in order to make faster progress. And this is especially relevant when we think about support for countries with developing public health systems, because after all, as a global community, we are only as safe as our weakest members. I'm optimistic when I look at the numbers in those countries that have high vaccination rates. If we look at mortality rates, we see exactly the right trends. The industry has done miracles in ramping up their production capacity. We have several vaccines on the market. We have international efforts like COVAX to cater to the needs of low and middle income countries. And I'm an eternal optimist, and I hope that we will sooner be in a situation that we can go back to a normal life. We should be concerned about mutations, yes, but especially the novel mRNA technology would enable us to adapt vaccines super fast and use them without extensive clinical trial programs, maybe a shorter bridging program. So all in all, what really matters is the resilience of healthcare systems, and it's a functioning innovation ecosystem. And if we combine these public and private approaches, we can tackle such challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Osman, and thank you also for highlighting the need for spirit of collaboration and working together in order to get us out of this pandemic. Dr. Moshitsky, what's your take on how to move forward and how to find a pragmatic approach?
Well, thank you very much for having me join this illustrious panel. And going forth in such an illustrious panel usually means that you are underlining and reinforcing many of the things that have been said before you. But let me maybe break down my thinking here into the prepare for the unexpected on one hand, and how we move forward with proactive pragmatism. So when I think about preparing for the unexpected, I think the thing that really is the most saving issue beyond our public health measures of masking, et cetera, is the creation of the vaccine. And the way that we did it in a miraculous amount of time was through a continuous investment in technology. The fact that we had messenger RNA technology ready to be deployed at this time, and our ability to so rapidly decode the genetic issues related to this virus, is what allowed us to move with an amazing degree of speed. And so continuing to invest in that technology is important. And as such, I think we still have to recognize that intellectual property is the lifeblood of that continuous flow of investment into that level of technology. And we should not let go of that too quickly. I think as we talk about the proactive pragmatism, it is to make use of these miracles of the vaccines and really to vaccinate. And as we do so, we have to support the continued manufacturing of these agents, and that recognizes that it takes an incredible degree of expertise. These are complex vaccines. They are not easily just ship it over to one place or another and have it reproduced. It takes true expertise, and the companies are now collaborating in an amazing way, working with each other, recognizing who has the right expertise, and then sharing the ability to increase manufacturing. They are also like flying an airplane and repairing it at the same time. They are working night and day to increase manufacturing capabilities, not only through the collaborations, but even in their own technologies, so that we're seeing, hundreds of millions of doses now being produced, and an ever increasing amount that is coming out. But this also requires regulatory flexibility to aid in this kind of rapid change, to aid in repurposing of the manufacturing facilities to support that. And I want to emphasize the importance of geographic diversity of the supply chain necessary to achieve this. We have an ecosystem that is built on this geographic diversity, and that is a strength, not a weakness. And so we must be sure that we do not close borders to the supply chain, and that we continue to work collaboratively around the globe to achieve this. I think that we shouldn't forget that we have another tool that we can deploy, and that is therapeutic agents. When patients are sick, we actually have agents that are underutilized, at least in the United States. For example, monoclonal antibodies have shown to be significantly effective in reducing hospitalizations and deaths. So in the US now, we have used monoclonals in about 350,000 people. Now, if you look at the clinical trials, that would indicate that we have prevented already by that number 17,550 hospitalizations and well over 7,000 deaths just through the use of monoclonals. And we have a number of antivirals underway now that are specifically aimed at coronavirus. We've been studying, of course, and looking at repurposing other antivirals, but I think a new generation of those is now on their way to be able to be deployed as well to help us treat those who actually do become ill with this. So, I think there are many number of fronts, both pragmatic and getting ready for the next pandemic as well, which I know you're going to want to talk about.
Well, let's hope that takes some time. Let's deal with this one first. Thank you so much, Richard, for your perspective and for also giving us a little bit more insight into the industry's role in this pandemic, which I would love to talk about a little bit more later on in this discussion. But since we are here from both sides of the Atlantic and trying to also build the bridge and learn from each other, and Dr. Osman, you said, well, it doesn't help to point the finger always to the other side, and it changes all the time. Who does it best? Who is the role model? Are there, in all this back and forth and all this discussion and crisis, are there opportunities maybe to move closer together? The last years have shown that we have rather moved away from each other, and lots of nationalism and silo mentality has dominated our thinking in not only policy, but also in practice and healthcare. Is there an opportunity right now? And if yes, I hope so, but if yes, how could we initiate also this collaboration, not only within the healthcare industry in a particular country, but also cross-nationally, in order to benefit from everything we know and bring it all to the table and lift it up for a solution of the situation?
I think you were addressing the question to Lisa, correct?
To everybody, whoever wants to take a stand, and we'd love to have a really interactive discussion. So yeah, Dr. Osman, please.
I feel an unprecedented sense of collaboration. I can competently talk about the industry. We have global partnerships. You have BioNTech, Pfizer. You have AstraZeneca, Jenner Institute, Serum Institute of India, and we have so many partnerships that have really worked extremely well in this pandemic on the industry side. I'm not really competent to comment about governments. I feel that the role of the WHO, we are in a desperate need of a strong WHO. WHO is under-resourced, over-politicized, has been distracted from their real purpose. We need to strengthen WHO. We have important other collaborative efforts. There's Gavi, there's CEPI, there's COVAX. There are accelerators like mediated through the Gates Foundation. So I think that people are actually very, very eager to collaborate in this crisis. We had mentioned, Richard had mentioned the global supply chains. You know, I'm seeing with a lot of concern this vaccine nationalism. We had in the U.S. under the previous administration, we had seen such moves, and with the legal situation in the U.S., the rated orders, etc. It is sometimes, I mean, we produce most of our products in the United States. Actually, it is sometimes very difficult for us to export, even to manufacturers who make vaccines in Europe, for instance, for the United States. What we've heard from the EU Commission lately about vaccine export restrictions, I find severely counterproductive. We have global supply chains, not only for the vaccine as such, but also for the many products that go into vaccine manufacturing. And governments need to be aware of that. I'm talking a lot to heads of government, ministers of health these days. They're receptive, but the knee-jerk reaction is a nationalist or whatever approach, and we must move beyond that.
Mm-hmm. So, would you like to comment on, you know, I mean, why is it working in R&D and the industry and not necessarily among governments?
Well, I wasn't necessarily going to comment on that point. I did want to circle back on the broader idea of partnerships. And because I can appreciate that we all represent or wear different hats here, and I am coming with the government hat. So I want to call on the ambassador's comments about multilateralism and acknowledge that that is something that we are working closely together on. And I think that the US and Germany came together around strengthening WHO following the Ebola crisis. And that's something that we hope to do now following COVID-19. And I know that there are ongoing deliberations in those forums that allow for that to happen. And so I can appreciate the professor outlining those on my behalf. I think that's quite helpful. But also some of the other collaboratives that have been mentioned. I mean, the ACT Accelerator, right? That is a big deal to have had all of these agencies and these other stakeholders come together across these various needs, whether they're in therapeutics, diagnostics, vaccines, or health systems, broadly speaking. And so I think that is a demonstration of the power of the collective, and I hope that we can continue to demonstrate that moving forward. I think the last thing I would offer as well, in response to your question, Professor Yanis, is how we can also do things like data sharing, right? And really try and understand through scientific exchange more information about variants or more information about how vaccines and therapeutics are responding to these variants. I think we've had Dr. Maszewski also speak to monoclonal antibodies, and we know that in some cases they're not as responsive to these variants, and I think we learned that through scientific cooperation. So by having these exchanges and by being open to those, we can only do better together.
That's great. Thank you, Lois. And I have the feeling if we have more people like you together and lifting it up, it will happen, and we will make it. Nevertheless, I mean, as we know, the critical thing in a pandemic and management in a pandemic is speed. And that's, of course, also an issue Professor Wieler has highlighted often on German television in the beginning of the pandemic and throughout the whole year. Why is it so slow? Why is response so slow? And we've seen that in different countries. And then, you know, sometimes it feels like one country is catching up and overtaking another one. But in general, response seems to be a little bit retarded. And also there's a certain level of, oh, surprise, we didn't expect this. Although you, Professor Wieland, and many other scientists have predicted a second wave and have really pointed out the issues that we have to act early, and things have usually happened too late. Why is that the case? And can we change that?
Well, from my experience, what I have to say, and I think first of all, I'd like to echo what has been said about the collaboration. Let me just briefly summarize the experience that I have since last January. I've never been in as many video conferences, telephone conferences with all people all over the world, be it colleagues in other national public health institutes, be it people in WHO, be it people in other institutions, scientific institutions, university, than I've been during this pandemic. So we're exchanging data, knowledge in an unprecedented way and in a very open way. And what we have to learn clearly is we should more basically harmonize these data sharing and these data gathering. I mean, we're learning so much from clinical trials. We're learning so much from countries that are vaccinating very early, for example. So the openness for this is as high as it never has been before, because we are tackling a pandemic, and we're not tackling only a scientific problem here, or an issue that we want to be faster than the next one, because we know that the whole world is in this boat. So this is something I have to say. So and we should keep this spirit, yeah, not only in industry but in science, and this should be a spirit that we really should try to maintain. Why are people so unresponsive? I mean, Stefan Osman pointed it out. It's very, very human. It's psychology. You only, you know, when you once put your hand on an oven, on a hot oven, you will never do it again. But obviously you need to put the hand on this hot oven once until you understand. And this is something I simply don't understand. You know, it's human, but it's psychology. The second surge in Germany was absolutely foreseeable. It was very clear for all scientists, for all of those who really are working on facts. And I don't want to talk here about fake news and these other issues that undermine, of course, a public opinion. But obviously, it's of human nature that you think it's going to work out. We can make it. We will survive it. And obviously, the understanding that you have to be preventive as soon as possible. I have the impression that in politics, and I'm not a politician, but what I've seen in many parts of the world, in politics, it seems that the reaction is only when something has already happened. And this is something we have to learn, and we have to work with it, and we could do better. Obviously, it's a human nature. And the only thing that I very, very much felt is you can't close the door before some people have run against it. And it's I don't know whether we learn from it. We are going to the third surge now in Germany, and still the measures are not strong enough. So I simply don't understand this, and there should be. It's psychology, and I'm a little bit helpless regarding this. But obviously, we first have to feel it until we react. And hope seems to be a very, very effective way to look into the future. But we have to be factual, critical, and scientifically driven, and then life could be easier. That's my personal opinion here.
Thank you for your very honest and personal opinion. I really appreciate it, because if you look back, I mean, just comparing the pandemic with the 1918 Spanish flu, which was right after the First World War. At that time, people were probably in a different mindset and more worried about getting some food and surviving, and not thinking about their Easter vacation or something else that might be impacted by the pandemic. So I think, yes, we're dealing a lot with human psychology, with human expectations, how to manage these expectations, and also having the courage to manage it. I think that's a big issue also in policy. I mean, you said, yes, the scientific evidence is important, but then there has to be somebody who is actually going to tell the bad news, and to tell people that certain things will not be possible. So I think this topic is really important, Professor Wheeler, to look at the human aspects of this whole management of the pandemic, and try to also communicate well in order to get the message across, and also have the contribution from people in terms of their behavior, in terms of their maybe compliance or motivation to carry on, and to support the development towards a new normal.
There are a couple of things perhaps I would love to comment on with that too. And you know, I've never been more proud of my colleagues in industry in that regard. I think they have worked day and night to find these solutions in record times. And you know, having come from the FDA as well, I'm also extremely proud of the FDA in the US, who also worked day and night to be responsive to industry and to work in a dialogue. Which brings me to collaboration. I've, again, never seen anything like this. It's, you know, to use the overused word, unprecedented levels of collaboration, not only between regulators and industry, between government, BARDA and industry, between industry and industry. I mean, fierce competitors putting aside their competition to work together to do data sharing, you know, 20 companies came together to produce a database in which protocols could be shared, endpoints could be shared, in which you know, actual data from those clinical trials could be shared. And then I think Lois already pointed out active and the ability to create a public-private partnership, which gave organization to the sort of, albeit tremendous number of clinical trials, but to actually shape them so that we got useful information in an efficient manner was, I think, again, a sort of the best parts of humans that were standing up to put aside, you know, their differences to join together to find the right answers.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think that's, well, that's a perfect example of the good side of the good side of the pandemic, unprecedented collaborations in response to an maybe not so unexpected, but nevertheless unwished happening that came to us. Let us spend a little bit of time, and we have just 15 minutes left, on what comes next. So looking forward, all these essential points that you have mentioned in terms of collaboration, human factors to the good and the bad, managing those, taking R&D to the next level, all of these aspects, what would be the logical next steps if we have to prioritize, and if we have to draw a roadmap for the next 6 months? What would be the most useful and important to do right now when we get off this discussion in order to move forward?
Well, I'm happy to start here. I think that we have to absolutely step back and recognize the disparities with regards to how COVID-19 is affecting people in our respective countries and around the world, and understand how we can close those gaps, right? And so that's, I think, a commitment I would like us all to be able to make, is to really try and close those gaps, and not just with regards to what is in the news today around vaccines, but around therapeutics, around just generally access to care and information with regards to COVID, because we know that those disparities have been apparent since day one. And so that I think is something very important to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. So also the communication aspect of what we already have and sending the right messages, which
absolutely
I think is very often the problem also with respect to the role of the industry and everything that has happened, all the good things.
I think Lois points out another issue of that, that in the United States, we certainly saw, I think to an appalling degree, the health inequities that exist. And, I think trying to address those so that they are not present the next time is a really important aspect for at least us in the US to begin to address. And, I think, for example, making sure that our clinical trials have adequate diversity from underserved populations is something that now industry is galvanized to tackle and try to move forward with as another area. I think that, organizing ourselves is a simple thing, and planning is a simple thing. And trying to make sure that when this happens again, we already have learned our lessons, and there are many lessons here, so that we can immediately employ those kind of lessons, immediately go to platform trials that we have thought about in advance, to immediately go to the use of digital technologies, which we're using right now, and allowing us to really communicate with each other, but moving clinical trials into the digital space is another really important aspect of what we should be preparing ourselves for as we move into that future. And I think that keeping the dialogues very open, I think one of the mechanisms that work extremely well were, for example, the development of being able to have advanced procurement by governments was a very important thing. And I actually think that we shouldn't neglect how that kind of investment was able to advance tools very quickly, and respecting our global nature as a humankind. I think we should never lose sight of as we have all of these particular dialogues and recognizing that pandemics cross all borders. I think that and thinking about the next one may not be as easy, in fact, if it's not a virus, if it's a resistant bacterium, and we do not have antibiotics. We will not be able to produce antibiotics with mRNA vaccines so quickly. We will need more antibiotics, and I think things like putting together the AMR Action Fund recently was an important step to create those kind of new antibiotics for whatever the next pandemic might be.
Mm-hmm. And who should be in charge of organizing? You mentioned organizing ourselves, planning. Who is going to do that job best?
Yeah. Well, I hope it's a bringing together of the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. That it really has to be, it can't just be government by itself, although they have to play a role. That is what they exist for. But I do think that, industry, academia, patients, organizations, we all need to come together to think about this towards the future.
I think there will be a time when we need to start about how to prepare ourselves for the next pandemic or the next challenge. And I very much agree with the statement on antimicrobial resistance. We've been talking about that for several years. This is a problem looming. We must address this. But currently, we're still extremely busy with managing this crisis. If you look into the pharmaceutical, the biopharmaceutical, and the life science tool industry, we're working really like crazy to ramp up production, and this is no small task. It is incredibly difficult. You need, I know there's a bottleneck for single-use bioreactors. There's a bottleneck for lipids. There's a bottleneck for virus filters, etc. And we're working so hard on that, and the progress that is being made is amazing. At the same time, we must acknowledge that different countries have different successes. There was an interesting article in the New York Times recently with the hypothesis that they said in the first wave, it was the more liberal regimes that were more successful because they were focusing on solidarity. Now in the second wave, and especially when it comes to the rollout of vaccination programs, the author hypothesized that it was more autocratic systems, and he counted the US into that bracket, that were more successful because the European Union is obsessed with equality and justice and not with outcome. I don't know, but we must acknowledge that other jurisdictions, the United States now, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, the UK, are doing a better job than the European Union, and we must learn the lessons as to why. In my observation, the successful countries have appointed a Corona czar, and I don't know what the female form of czar is, czaress maybe, with a single point of responsibility, and usually somebody with either military or industry experience who can manage supply chains effectively and manage such a complex logistics issue. That's been the case in the United States, in the UK, in Israel, and elsewhere. In the European Union, we have overly complex decision-making processes, and we must rapidly learn our lesson from that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Osman. I think you're putting a very important point on the table, and again, that of course questions the role of government. If the management is best delegated to a former military or industry expert, maybe it's a little bit of both. Again, a collaboration, but proof has been made that those kind of people with that kind of experience seem to be successful. So maybe something to exchange and to learn from. Professor Wieler, what do you think? What's the most important for the next 6 to 12 months? If you have to do something right now.
So first of all, I can only echo to all what has been said, but I want to point to another dimension here. So, you know, as a public health person, I'm always interested into seeing, why does a problem exist? Why did it exist? Obviously, in terms of solving a problem, there are different approaches, and some are more successful than others. And I can also only echo Stefan Osman regarding some complicated decision-making and bureaucracy, which clearly is not a good help when it comes to crisis management. But let's look back to the reason why these pandemics happen, and we know the reasons. First of all, we humans are destroying our nature, our Earth. So we need sustainable development. We need sustainable economies. We need sustainable future. And so climate change and all these issues, we need to work on these. Why did this pandemic happen? We don't know yet, but for sure, the origin of this virus, the highest take here is that it comes from bats. However it came from these bats to humans, maybe we'll never find out, but clearly the highest stake here is that it came from bats. And how does it come from bats to humans? Obviously, we are too close to these bats for whatever reasons. Maybe because we do too much animal trade, maybe because we eating too much of these animals, we are rising, I don't know. But principle, it's based on the nature of humans, many mistakes we did and we are still doing. So the first of all I'd want to mention here is the Sustainable Development Goals. We should try to make them living, and then we should get back our biodiversity. And this is the same issue with antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance is 100% human-made, 100%. Here we are in full, how to say, so we are fully responsible for this. And why is this? So first of all, because we have too many infections, and this is because too many people don't have access to clean water, for example, or they are living in circumstances like in Yemen or in other areas. There are crises that are human-made crises. So first of all, we should really get our thinkings along, how can we make this world a better place? And then we won't have so many of these difficulties, to be very clear here. And antibiotic resistance is only made because we use them in an unresponsible way, because we have too many infections, too many people that live in circumstances that they get easily infected. So let's keep these living conditions better places. And then if we have reduced these infections, we don't have to use antibiotics. Yeah. So clearly, I think this is the one issue that we have to take care of: sustainable development of the whole world, climate change, and so on and so on. And the next then is what has been, and I like to echo this. Yes, we need to collaborate in all different areas. And I think what this pandemic has shown is it's not only a medical problem, but it's a whole over society challenge that we have to tackle. And we can only tackle it if there's solidarity and understanding of each other's needs and wishes. And this is pretty human. Yeah, we need to respect not only our neighbor, but also our planet and our animals and plants.
Yeah, that's right. That's the most important. That's the basis for everything else. I'd love to take 2 questions from the audience because we have quite a lot. Unfortunately, not much time left. But there's one question asking again about the collaborative effort between regulatory bodies and the industry. How can we ensure that that is becoming like a continuous situation and a permanent partnership, and not just for fighting the pandemic and then everybody goes his or her own way again? How can we ensure that public-private partnership persists in the future?
No, I think that's a fair question, because in this talk of normalcy and the return to normalcy, there's a question that I've had, which is, what is normal anymore, right? Now that we've lived through what we've lived through. And I think people have spoken about the ways that we might change forever, and the ways that we do business, the ways we interact with one another might forever be changed to some degree, which might not be entirely bad in cases such as cooperation, right? And so others already spoke to, for example, the level of cooperation between the FDA and industry. I think you can say that broadly with industry and the Department of Health and Human Services here in the US. And I'd like to think that there are lessons learned from that collaboration and through those engagements or partnerships that can carry forward in the spirit of public health and good.
Okay, thank you so much, Lois. One more comment maybe on the continuing collaborative effort and how that could be carried into the future, and then we'll have to wrap it up, unfortunately. Richard?
Yes, I'd love to say that, yes, I think seeing this continue a dialogue between the regulators and industry is key, not just for pandemics, but for some of the most difficult problems we have. Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease. To a great degree, it already exists with oncology, but we really still have some real hard medical unmet needs that we have to address. And why not apply these learnings to begin to tackle those in a way that we have not been able to achieve previously? But I also want to add, since this is a global audience, that the regulators also need to talk to each other on a global scale. We are global companies, for example, and we do global development. We do global clinical trials. We want our products, whether they are for whatever they're designated for or indicated for, we want them available to our global community that we feel we serve. And so making sure that we have international harmonization as much as possible I think is a key tool to speed the provision of these products to everybody.
Thank you so much, Richard, and everybody else. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I think we would have had topics and questions until late night today. Just to summarize very briefly, so this is for the last year, this has been the prime time of public health and collaborative response to something that was unexpected, or rather unwished, that came to us. And most importantly, we have to deal with the human side, to the good and the bad in this pandemic. We have to rely, or we should rely, on the credibility of experts, the power of innovation, and the resilience of people. And of course, learn from each other and benefit from our international exchange, getting to one table in order to move into the future and look forward and hopefully a better future for everybody. I'd like to thank again the German consulates in Boston and San Francisco, and the German American Business Council in Boston, as well as the German American Business Association in Northern California, and the German Embassy in Washington, DC, for organizing this exchange, and of course, all panelists and speakers for their insightful contributions, and also for all the questions. Unfortunately, we were not able to answer everything. Maybe there will be a follow-up. I hope so, because I think there's a lot to discuss and to hopefully resolve in the next couple of months. With that, I wish you all a beautiful day and a nice evening wherever you might be. Take care, be safe, and enjoy what you can. Bye-bye.